everybody, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Thursday, the 2nd of June. What I wanted to do was to continue our discussions about what life might have been like for female in the 1800s and then segue into Frankenstein, our first major text of the semester. And you can see in the notes below that I've got several sources listed that I wanted to briefly talk about. One was entitled The American Girl's Handybook. It came out in 1887. It was written by Linda and Adelia Beard. They helped to form girls' clubs and organizations, including the Campfire Girls. And basically, this was a text about arts and crafts and activities that girls could engage in. But I wanted to read you a section of the foreword from that text. If girls in Victorian America were confused, who could blame them? From every quarter, they heard conflicting voices, each confidentially articulating its own version of what girls needed. One voice belonged to Dr. Edward Clark, retired member of the Harvard University Medical Faculty, author of the 1873 book, Sex and Education, or Fair Chance for the Girls. Fair chances notwithstanding, Dr. Clark enlisted his medical training to denounce the phenomenon of advancing education for adolescent girls. Whether at teaching training institutions, women's colleges, or co-educational state universities, Clark warned, girls were in grave danger of physical and mental ruin. The reason? The female body, with its limited available energy, could not successfully meet the physical demands of puberty while also enduring the mental strain of study. Something would have to give, and what essentially gave were the reproductive organs. Citing case studies of Vassar women, Clark sought to provide scientific evidence that too much study, and certainly any attempt to match male educational achievements, would sap the developing female organs, leaving girls weak, nervous, and sterile. A frightening prospect for what girl wanted to end up like 18-year-old Miss D, who emerged from 4 years at Vassar, a hysterical invalid, her breasts and reproductive organs withered from excessive study and physical exercise. Now, while Dr. Clark prescribed large quantities of rest for growing girls, others suggested that girls were too idle and too confined. Dress reformers routinely denounced the restrictive clothing worn by fashionable Victorian women and their imitative daughters. Laced into tight corsets, carrying some 15 pounds of material from their cinched waists, these girls seemed unable to breathe, let alone engage in any kind of strenuous activity. If girls were anemic and subject to fashionable fits of fainting, or afflicted with anorexic-like diseases, the reformers argued, what they needed was plenty of outdoor exercise, protein-rich diets, and new clothing styles that emphasized function over fashion. So, how reassuring then was the American Girl's Handybook? In a tone both sensible and self-assured, Linda and Adelia Beard's approach to girlhood was through its opportunities and possibilities, not its limitation. And it goes on in talking about how the Beard sisters talked about the American girl ranged in age from 8 to 18 and would love nature, would be healthy and vigorous, would be handy, and have a certain level of independence. So that's the foreword to the reprint of this particular text, the American Girl's Handybook. There was also an American Boy's Handybook that came out at approximately the same time, where it talked about the benefits and advantages that boys had in terms of exercising their freedoms. And obviously, this is in direct contrast to the concept of what female would be like. And in fact, it even says in the foreword to that text, boys were free in a way that no woman ever was in her entire life, or would even desire to be. And this person, Daniel Beard, he also was the founder of the Scouting movement. So you can see how these particular texts help to establish for young children the ideals that they were supposed to aspire to in terms of gender. And another text that I wanted to briefly refer you to would be Darwin's Origin of Species that came out in 1859. that literally argued that women were inferior because of their abilities to reproduce, which is something that basically the earlier text has suggested as well. That women were subordinate because of their role in reproduction, and that women were inferior because of this, and that meant that they shouldn't become politically active or overly educated, that their primary role was to bear and care for children. The man's role was to support and protect his family. So the intellectual abilities of men increased because they used logic and reason to survive. Nature requiring less from a woman because of her role in procreation, and that being purely physical. That the formation of a child inside of a womb, nor the production of milk in a breast, is dependent on a female's ability to think. And therefore, because females did not have to exercise their minds as much, their minds evolved at a much slower rate than their male counterparts. And there was even a science called craniology that argued that it would be obvious that females were intellectually, that men were intellectually superior, and women were intellectually inferior just because of the size of the brains. That men's brains were obviously larger. And also that men consumed more calories, and that they were also physically superior, which meant that they would be intellectually superior. And that ultimately this less evolved brain was not able to think as logically, that being supposedly the female brain. So over and over again you see the same message. And when I was once visiting a friend in New Jersey, I went to an antique shop, and I came across this little gem that you can see that I posted a picture of below. And it's a 1906 medical pamphlet entitled, "Is College Bad for Girls?" And it argues that college is bad for girls, and some of the articles are the evils of dormitory life, midnight hours of who knows what, or forming unladylike habits that may harm the health and morals of a delicate girl, such as smoking or card playing. And of course, the habit of reading improper novels, magazines, and other suggestive literature, which is, of course, what this class happens to be. So this was the cover of the booklet that I found framed in that antique store, and I have actually hanging in my office if you were ever to visit my office. A teacher's contract from 1923. And these were the elements associated with that teacher's contract. That the teacher would not get married. The contract would become null and void immediately if the teacher married. Keep this in mind when we're reading texts like Jane Eyre. That she should not keep company with men, and she should be at home between the hours of 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. unless in attendance at a school function. That she should not loiter downtown in ice cream parlors. So I always like to joke with my students, that's where you will find me this summer, in an ice cream parlor. Not to leave town at any time without the permission of the chair of the board of trustees. Not to smoke cigarettes. Not to drink beer, wine, or whiskey. Not to ride in a carriage or automobile with any man except her brothers or father. Not to dress in bright clothing. Not to dye her hair. And it continues on. To wear at least 2 petticoats. To not to wear dresses more than 2 inches above the ankle. To keep the classroom clean, to sweep the classroom floor, to scrub the floor at least once a week with soap and hot water, to clean the blackboards daily, to start the stove at 7 a.m. so the room would be warm by 8 a.m. when the children arrived, and to carry out the ashes at least once a day, and to not use face powder, mascara, or paint the lips. Not to belabor the point, but I wanted to end with something called the Good Wives Guide, that there's been some dispute as to whether or not this is completely accurate. It would have been a guide for female that would have appeared in a women's magazine in the 1950s. If you'll remember that we had spent our last class talking about women's magazines from the 1800s. So even though this may not necessarily be entirely accurate, I think the sentiment is accurate. And there were a list of points in this article about what a woman should do. Again, think of the date, 1955. Have dinner ready. Plan ahead even the night before because you want to be concerned about his needs. Prepare yourself. Take 15 minutes to rest. You'll be refreshed when he arrives. Be a little bit more interesting and happy when he arrives. Clear away the clutter. During the cooler months of the year, you should prepare and light a fire for him to unwind by. Your husband will feel he's reached a haven of rest. Minimize all noise. Be happy to see him. Greet him with a warm smile and show sincerity in your desire to please him. Listen to him. You may have a dozen important things to tell him, but the moment of his arrival is not the time. Let him talk first. Remember, his topics of conversation are more important than yours. Don't greet him with complaints and problems. Don't complain if he's late for dinner or even if he stays out all night. Count this as minor compared to what he might have gone through at work. Make him comfortable. Make him lean back in a comfortable chair, or have him lean back in a comfortable chair, or lie him down in the bedroom. Have a cool or warm drink ready for him. Arrange his pillow. Offer to take off his shoes. Speak in a low, soothing, and pleasant voice. Don't ask him questions about his actions or question his judgment or integrity. Remember, he's the master of the home, and as such will always exercise his will with fairness and truthfulness. You have no right to question him. A good wife always knows her place. And of course, throughout all of this, the assumption is that all marriages are heterosexual. So, as we continue to read text, and I think you got a sense of this in the story of an hour, but definitely we will get a sense of this throughout the text over the course of the semester, there was definitely pushback. And while Frankenstein is a very male-centric text, I think it's very deliberately a male-centric text to show how things can go wrong when female is excluded from male world, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But I also wanted to draw your attention to the fact that I have posted in our Moodle site, in the syllabus and other documents folder, some suggested paper topics that we'll discuss later as the semester progresses. But since this is a condensed session, I wanted you to be aware that those topics are there, and they're very general. I was suggesting that you might want to think about imagery or character or theme or comparing and contrasting, or of course gender. As I said, we'll review this as well as some of the conventions for writing a paper as the semester progresses. My thinking is that your first paper would address probably the first set of readings, either Frankenstein or Persuasion. The story of an hour is also a possibility, though writing about a short story is a very different kind of exercise than writing about a novel. And that the second paper would be a very similar exercise, but just on the later sets of text that we would be reading, either Jane Eyre or Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl or The Awakening. And your first journal on Frankenstein, according to our syllabus and our course outline, is supposed to be due this upcoming Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. I have not necessarily become wedded to these particular dates, and because I wanted to make sure that we had ample time to discuss Frankenstein, I have no problem with accepting that journal on the Thursday instead, which happens to be the 9th at 11:59 p.m. Either is fine. You don't need to ask for an extension in this instance if you decide to hand it in on Thursday. I do ask that you submit in your written work via PDF to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. The journals being informal, approximately a page or so of reflections and questions and thoughts. And I will not be evaluating for grammar or mechanics, basically just for content. Think of it as a conversation on paper, as opposed to the academic papers. They're two over the course of the semester. That will be approximately 4 to 5 pages long. And again, I have some suggested paper topics in the syllabus and other documents folder that you can refer to now, but I'm going to be talking about more in depth over the course of the semester. But I wanted to begin the conversation about Frankenstein talking about Mary Shelley, who happens to be the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft. You might have heard of her. She was a feminist. And I think that's going to be very important in terms of understanding Mary Shelley's perspective in writing Frankenstein. And the way the story came about, it was part of a horror story competition where she and Percy Shelley, the great romantic poet, and several friends were vacationing, and the weather was rather dreary. So instead of going out and enjoying their vacation, they stayed indoors and they challenged each other to a ghostwriting competition. And that night, Mary Shelley had a dream about the very famous, at this point infamous, creation scene in Frankenstein, and she used that as a springboard for writing Frankenstein. And a little piece of trivia, this is a very important night for the world of the Gothic. So you know I also teach Gothic literature, in that one of the friends was named Dr. Polidori, and he wrote a short story entitled The Vampire that we think inspired Bram Stoker's very famous text Dracula, which is also very important in the Gothic tradition. Frankenstein straddles a lot of genres. So Frankenstein is important in the Gothic tradition. It's also important in science fiction, and it also is important in the feminist world. So you can see how Frankenstein is a very flexible text. One of the things that I like to do about Frankenstein is to talk a little bit about how unusual it would be for a female author to be writing about themes associated with the Gothic, which was a kind of writing that was very popular in the late 1800s. Texts like Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where oftentimes you would have a female under siege, and what you would have is a monster, which in Latin, monster means to show or to reveal. So I think that this is more than just a literal monster. It can also be a metaphor or a symbol for some of the other monstrosities in the world. And that this monster would ultimately reveal truths about its time period. And you could expect the setting to be very dark and gloomy, very much what you think of when you think of Halloween today. And oftentimes you would have elements of the supernatural, or at least possible elements of the supernatural. So that said, you don't usually think of female authors participating in this genre, but Mary Shelley helped to create the genre. And also, Mary Shelley helped to create the genre of science fiction. The distinction being that science fiction, the elements that are examined in science fiction, could occur through scientific advances. And the idea behind the Gothic is that this would be something that would be supernatural, that which is beyond the natural world or natural explanation. And we'll see how Frankenstein straddles both. And of course, for the purposes of our class, we'll talk about Mary Shelley as female author and her writing a very male-centric text. Her husband, again, the great romantic poet, whom she had an affair with actually prior to marriage, so she lived a somewhat scandalous life. He edited the text and suggested expansions, actually. So as you are reading Frankenstein, if you think that in some places it might be a bit long-winded, particularly these long descriptions of nature, those were probably Percy's suggestions. I always thought that it was a little bit of sexism to sort of suggest that perhaps she isn't completely responsible for Frankenstein because of the edits and the suggestions from Percy, because I think if it had happened the other way around and she had given suggestions for edits to Percy, we wouldn't have the conversation as to whether or not Percy was the true author of his works. And probably most people know Frankenstein not from Mary Shelley's text, but from Hollywood, specifically the 1930s Universal Studio film. And the 1930s helped to bring about many of the Gothic films that have become iconic in our society, including Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So as you know, I also teach a class in horror film. And one of the things we talk about in that particular class is why these particular films captured the American imagination the way they did. And as is oftentimes the case with film, there are adaptations that are made. And in terms of Frankenstein, the adaptations are rather significant. The book is very, very different than the plot of the film, than the structure of the film. Even the character names are changed in the film. And of course, the length. And the typical length of a Hollywood film would be approximately an hour to 15 minutes to an hour and a half. So it's going to be very difficult to be able to translate a novel into that time period accurately. And I always say that both of these are excellent texts, the film and the book, but I read them as separate entities, not necessarily one trying to mimic the other. And I thought it would be useful for us to watch that 1931 iconic film, directed by James Whale, and it made Boris Karloff the creature. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next class. Also, a very profitable career. Luckily, I was able to find the link online where you can watch this film for free. And one of the reasons why I want you to watch this film is not to substitute for the text. Film is never a substitute for the text, but particularly in this instance, the film is so different. But to think about some of the changes that were made and why some of those changes were made by Hollywood, and ultimately why that was embraced as our iconic version of Frankenstein. This I can tell you, Frankenstein does not have a square head with bolts. That's Hollywood. So the film is approximately an hour and 15 minutes long. I also thought this would give you the weekend to catch up with Frankenstein, and you should also be preparing for our next text of the semester, and that happens to be Persuasion. So I know that if you are in the midst of Frankenstein now, you probably are quite surprised, and that anything that Hollywood might have prepared you for in terms of that text is not what you are getting. You're first introduced to a character named Walton and a ship, and its voyage. No, it's not that you're reading the wrong text. This is very important, this frame that Shelley gives us, that again is completely dismissed in most of the versions that we see of Frankenstein, and certainly the iconic 1931 Frankenstein. And I'll give you a hint if you are reading Frankenstein right now, that you need to keep in mind that the entire tale is told by Walton, that we never meet any of the other characters. This is Walton telling us what was told to him by Victor. And that means that we are going to have an unreliable narrator. So if you haven't finished Frankenstein, you will revisit Walton at the ending of the text. But Walton begins our text, and then we go into Victor, and it's very easy to forget that we are listening to Walton's transcriptions to his sister rather than listening to Victor speaking, because he's literally writing things down in the way that Victor would have said them, right down to using the I. But keep that in mind, because when we get to the ending of the text, we will return to Walton. So we never have an eyewitness account of the events that occur. But again, the Hollywood film is going to be quite different. Keep in mind, the 1930s were the very early days of filmmaking. So it probably is not going to be something that will seem completely familiar to you. And I thought that what today's attendance question could be is about that iconic film, and that you would answer that in our class discussion forum, and you have 48 hours to do that. So that will be due by Saturday, the 4th at 9 a.m. So if you need additional time, please let me know. Did you like or dislike the 1931 film version of Frankenstein, and why? Did you like or dislike the 1931 film version of Frankenstein, and why? And then what we will do next class is I will talk about Frankenstein. I hope by that point you will have completed the text if you haven't already done so. And as I indicated, technically a journal would be due on that day at 11:59 p.m., but I have no problem with your handing it in on the Thursday if you prefer. And we will also talk a little bit more about writing papers next week. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.